today for our No Jab, No Job session. I've got a feeling that when we look back at the end of 2021, we'll find that jab is one of those words of the year, used in this context anyway, because I think it seems to have become a shortcut for immunization, vaccination, whatever you want to call it at this stage. But we're all used to referring to jabs now. I saw someone this morning in an email actually referred to it as being stabbed, which sounded a bit more violent perhaps than a jab, so we'll stick to jab. Thanks for tuning in today. My name's Matthew Cole. I'm a partner in the employment team here. I specialise in employment and data protection, and of course there's a bit of an overlap when we look at that. I'm delighted to be joined today by Lou Plant. Lou is a senior associate in the team who specialises in health and safety, and we're going to do a bit of a double act today, looking at the issues associated with the vaccine. Please do use the Q&A facility on here. If there are any questions as we go through them, we'll deal with them. But if it makes sense to leave them to the end, then we'll do a roundup at the end as well. So any relevant questions we'll deal with as we go, but otherwise we'll probably leave them to the end. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, just looking at where we are in terms of vaccinations and what that potentially means. Then I'm going to pass over to Lou, who's going to ask the question of being able to force employees to be jabbed and what the law is around that. And then really picking up on this issue that we've seen with Pimlico plumbers and various others about whether we can decide only to employ employees who have been vaccinated and the health and safety issues that come from there. I'm then going to take over to look at the discrimination issues, and perhaps that's been the most argued about area when looking at vaccination, when looking at that in the employment context and the law. To what extent would it be potentially discriminatory to require vaccinations? Then we're going to look at unfair dismissal. Discrimination is one aspect, but the other is unfair dismissal. To what extent could we actually dismiss employees for not having the jab? We'll then look at perhaps what we should be doing at the moment, or where we should be moving to in terms of documentation. There's been a lot around having no jab, no job clauses in contracts, so we'll touch on that, but also more widely about what kind of policies and documentation you might want to be put into place, and some of the other more practical issues. And then you kind of escaped your knowledge that we had Mr. Johnson speaking on Monday about the roadmap, and Lou's going to pick up on some of the health and safety considerations just coming out of that roadmap. So that's what we're going to deal with. As I said, please feel free to use the Q&A button to ask some questions, and we'll leave some time for questions on that at the end. Questions we're happy to take on the subject of this seminar, or any more sort of wider or random issues which are of concern to you. So there we are. So just in terms of the current situation on vaccinations, let's just make sure we know where we are. There's an awful lot of uncertainty still around vaccinations. We know that there seems to be a high degree of effectiveness with vaccinations, i.e. it seems to prevent or significantly reduce the prospect that someone will have COVID symptoms develop and become ill through COVID. It's not yet clear, although the signs are positive, that it prevents transmission from one person to another. I.e., is it the case that the vaccine just protects that individual who is infected from developing symptoms, or at least reducing those symptoms, or does it actually stop the transmission? And I think that's a key issue for us when we're looking at this debate about how we use vaccines in the workplace. It looks like all UK adults are to be offered a first jab by July, and you'll recall that for most of the vaccines here, you need 2 jabs to be fully effective. But the first jab in both the Pfizer-BioNTech and the AstraZeneca vaccines appear to give a good level of immunity with a booster up to 12 weeks later doing the job. Another vaccine is likely to come on stream in the summer, the Moderna vaccine, which is going through clinical trials at the moment. So there will be 3. It's also worth just noting, I think, what's happening in the rest of the world. There are an awful lot of other vaccines around and in development. And some of those vaccines will be more prevalent in other parts of the world. So the Sinotech, for example, in the Far East, a Chinese developed vaccine. We just need to keep that in mind, I think, certainly as we're going through this, that there are many vaccines, there are many different ways in which they are going to be acting. It is likely that they will have different degrees of efficacy. It's also likely that some may require a booster sooner than the other. It may also be the case that some give protection against certain strains of the vaccine, certain strains of the virus, and give better protection than others. All of those things are relevant, I think, as we start to look at this debate as to how vaccines are perceived in the workplace. So lots to keep in mind. Very uncertain environment. We've got to keep abreast of what's actually happening, probably for the next year or so. So at that point, I'm going to pass over to Lou, who's going to deal with the question of to what extent can we force people to have the vaccine, and indeed can we force people to have the vaccine? So over to you, Lou.
Thanks, Matthew. So the starting point, can we force employees to be jabbed? No, we can't. Our case law, our legislation is very settled at the moment, and there's no indication as a result of COVID that that's going to change. And there are 3 areas of settled law to this extent. First is the Public Health, the Control of Disease Act 1984. Now, this act provides the health minister with powers to make provision to deal with the spread of infections and to take appropriate steps in that situation. But Section 45E of that Act specifically states that those provisions do not include requiring a person to undergo medical treatment, and that specifically includes mandatory vaccinations. So our law at the moment is that you cannot force somebody to have a vaccination. Off the back of that, if you did force somebody, it could be deemed to be assault and battery, and you could be looking at being prosecuted in the criminal courts for forcing someone to undergo that treatment. And then finally, we have Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which protects people from being interfered with physically or psychologically, and that again includes mandatory vaccinations. So as far as the law is concerned in this country, we cannot force employees to be vaccinated. But that is, of course, a different issue to whether or not we can decide, or as an employer, can you decide to employ only employees who are vaccinated? Maybe, and Pimlico Plumbers is, as Matthew said, a good example at the moment. But I think at the moment that things remain to be seen, depending upon what happens in the next few months, as to whether or not we're going to be seriously having to consider this issue as employers. Now, it's going to be very much, I think, industry dependent, job role dependent, work layout dependent, and depending upon you as an employer, what you do, the way that you work, this issue might be something more important than in other industries. So say, for example, those that work in the healthcare industry, there might be a higher risk to the employees because of the work that they do, coming into contact with the virus itself, or they may be at an increased risk of spreading the virus to more vulnerable people. And in those industries, this might be an issue that those employers want to consider more seriously than other industries. Say, for example, at the moment, I'm working remotely. So if it was the case that my risk of spreading it or contracting it is much lower than someone who's on the front line in a healthcare setting. So it very much depends upon what you're doing. It may also take into account the layout of your workplace as well. If you're sitting in close proximity to a lot of people, your risk might be higher. But it's, as I said, very much dependent upon the job that you do, the role that you do, and the way that you work, I think. if this is an issue that is going to come up in the future. And as we said, that very much remains to be seen, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next few months. So can we decide only to employ employees who are vaccinated? Perhaps, but that remains to be seen. It may well be that a vaccinated workforce does have a selling point, and certainly Pimlico Plumbers is the example of that, where he's saying, well, you know, you can guarantee that my workers will be vaccinated. They will be at a less risk to you if they're coming into your employment, but off your house, sorry. But off the back of that, you've also got the fact that it could, on the flip side, it could be deemed to be interfering with someone's own personal choice whether or not you require your employees to be vaccinated. And we'll see again what happens. From a health and safety perspective, if it's the case that employers are requiring their employees to be vaccinated, and it's the case that we're then seeing these matters go through the courts, in terms of how they approach them, I think that the courts are going to be looking at the guidance. So from an employer's perspective, employees have duties under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 and the associated legislation to take steps to protect the health and safety of their employees. And the key words are as far as reasonably practicable. From the employee perspective, they themselves have a duty or an implied duty to act in the best interests of their employer and colleagues, and to take care of their own health and safety. So when it comes to vaccination, would it be reasonable? I think the courts will consider whether or not that's a reasonable instruction to require that your employees are vaccinated if you want a job with them. And again, going back to what I previously said, I think it's going to be very much case and industry specific. If, of course, we get to the point that these cases are going through the courts and this is becoming a real issue for employees. So again, case industry specific, whether or not as an employer you want to be saying that, because this isn't a straightforward matter by any stretch. And there are also other issues off the back of that. So say, for example, you are mandating that your employees have a vaccination, and then one of those employees has an adverse reaction, quite a serious adverse reaction to the vaccine. Could you then perhaps be responsible if a claim is brought? And that's something else that you're going to be wanting to think about, perhaps, again, if we get to this point. There are also potentially insurance issues off the back of it. It might be the case that, again, if you are frontline health workers and you have more of a risk, both from contracting or spreading the virus, that your insurance policy might say, you know, that would be reasonable for you to request that your employees are vaccinated, perhaps. And if it's not the case and something then happens, then you might be, you might find that your insurer perhaps wouldn't want to indemnify you. But again, the flip side of this, when the courts are going to be considering these matters, if they are, is they're going to be considering them against the backdrop of our settled law, which is that you can't force someone to have a vaccination. That is our settled law. And it will be that fine balance and that fine line between what is reasonably practicable in the situation, as opposed to someone's right not to be vaccinated, which is our settled law. And again, it will be interesting to see what happens over the next few months. So I'm now going to hand over, that's the health and safety perspective at the moment in terms of what we think might happen and what the courts might consider if we get those issues. I'm now going to hand over to Matthew with regards to the employment law aspects of this.
Okay, thanks, Lou. So I think what we see is, from a health and safety perspective, you know, I think as HR professionals, as employers, we can take two things. First of all, there's actually quite a strong presumption in the law that vaccination is a freedom of choice matter. And secondly, that when we're looking at health and safety, we always have to look very much at the particular circumstances of the situation, but obviously bearing in mind that duty of care to provide a safe system of work. When looking at employment law, and of course, a lot of the debate around this in the press has been driven by employment-related concepts. We really have to ask ourselves whether two things are lawful. Would it be lawful to say to someone, if you don't have the jab, then we won't hire you? Are we entitled as employers to say that? Secondly, to our existing staff, if you don't have the jab, then we will sack you. Rather stark message, and I don't suggest any of you put it in quite that stark a way, if you are going to give the message. But certainly that's the that's the underlying thing. So with those two things, are we able to say that, and what are the legal issues behind them? Well, discrimination is the first one, and this of course applies to the recruitment question as much as to the questions of sacking an employee, because of course discrimination rights are day one rights, whereas unfair dismissal rights tend to only kick in after 2 years. So where do we stand on discrimination? If we give that prescription, you can't work here unless you're jabbed, are we going to be falling foul of discrimination laws? As many commentators have said. Well, we just need to remember there are two types of discrimination. We have direct discrimination. I'm not employing you because you're a woman. I'm not employing you because you're over 50, etc. That's direct discrimination. And there I think there's minimal risk because there's nothing that says in law that protects someone other than the points which are outside of the Equality Act, which Louise raised about the right to make a choice. But there's nothing in the Equality Act that says one can or cannot discriminate against someone because of vaccine status. So I think direct discrimination on those lines is unlikely. But instead, I think we're into indirect discrimination, and I think there are some prospects of claims being made here, and I certainly think there will be attempts at making claims in this way. So let's just remind ourselves what we're talking about when we're talking about indirect discrimination. We're talking about a requirement that would apply to all employees, so in this case a requirement to be vaccinated, but where, because of a particular characteristic, whether that's, and obviously it's a protected characteristic under the Equality Act, so race, age, sex, disability, transgender status, nationality, sexual orientation, etc. Whether a particular group who share that protected characteristic are disproportionately adversely affected by that requirement. Okay, so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about indirect discrimination. Very simple example I always give is we will only recruit people who are over 6 feet tall, whereas you can have women who are over 6 feet tall and men who are under 6 feet tall. It clearly is a requirement or a condition that women are disproportionately adversely affected by, because fewer women than men are over 6 foot tall. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about indirect discrimination. So we're asking ourselves whether or not the requirement to be vaccinated is indirectly discriminatory in that way. What we've got to remember, and indirect discrimination is quite unusual in this regard, is that it's possible to have lawful indirect discrimination if the requirement that's applied is justified. If it's a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, then it's lawful indirect discrimination. So we have to deal with both of those questions. So where's this likely to come from in terms of the vaccine? Are any groups put at a particular disadvantage by a requirement to have a vaccine? Well, certainly at the moment the answer is yes. From an age perspective, younger people are not yet able to get the vaccine in most cases. So if you were now to apply a requirement that all employees should be vaccinated, then clearly you will be adversely discriminating, or you will be discriminating against those who are younger. But as we know, the intention is to be able to offer a vaccine to all of those over the age of 18 by mid-late summer, and if that goes to plan, then that's a protected characteristic that will fall away as being relevant to this, as more and more people can be vaccinated. And if we look at all going well through to October, November, December, then the prospects are that all over 18s will have been able to have had two vaccines, 2 doses of the vaccine, and will be, quotes, vaccinated, close quotes. So at the moment, absolutely, yes, indirectly discriminatory to put that requirement into place, but it will be something which dissipates over time. What about religious beliefs? This is something we've that's been around in the press quite a bit. Are religious beliefs or people who are of certain religions or who hold certain religious beliefs going to be adversely affected by a requirement to be vaccinated? Well, there are certainly no major religions that say an individual should not be vaccinated. There are some more marginal sects which have issues around vaccination, but certainly as a mainstream religion, there's no particular issue. Which brings us on to the second issue, which is, well, are there contents of the vaccine? Are there ingredients within the vaccines or the way in which the vaccines are constituted which could cause issues? And there's been quite a lot of misinformation around this, particularly aimed at the Muslim community, in that the vaccines may contain pork-related products, gelatin substitutes, etc. But there's some quite interesting things going on there. First of all, certainly the Pfizer and the BioNTech and the Moderna vaccines, the makers have all come out and said, no, there are no animal products whatsoever in those vaccines. So that's number one. Secondly, and when we look at some of the vaccines, so both the Russian vaccine and the Chinese vaccine, they've been more circumspect about precisely what is in them and whether they might actually contain some animal-related products. But what's happened there is that the various of the Islamic bodies have actually said, well, the sanctity of human life takes precedence, and it is not against the tenets of Islam for someone to have a vaccine, even if it may contain such products. So what we're seeing is faith groups are engaging in this debate, and certainly mainstream faith groups are very much taking the view that people should be vaccinated, and that religious beliefs should not prevent that vaccine from happening. So I think it's going to be quite difficult for individuals to assert that they have been discriminated against on the grounds of their religious beliefs because of their refusal to be vaccinated. So possibility remains, but I think it's quite a remote possibility. What about disability? Well, quite clearly, if someone had a particular medical condition which prevented them from being vaccinated, and that medical condition, either of itself or because of the effect of vaccine on it, reached the threshold for a disability within the Equality Act, then one can see how that would apply. But again, that's quite few and far between. Certainly, I did some trawling and looked for examples. I couldn't find any examples, and certainly the line being taken by medical advisors is that the vaccine will mitigate the effect of the virus on disability rather than causing any particular issues in itself. But certainly that remains an issue. There may be groups who, because of a particular disability, cannot be vaccinated. One of the interesting things that may come up there, of course, is phobias, and the extent to which a phobia to needles would constitute a disability which may justify not being vaccinated. I don't think it would, but we'll have to see where that goes. Maternity, there has been a recommendation, I think, that pregnant women do not receive the vaccine at the moment, and I think that's largely down to the extent to which clinical trials haven't cleared up that issue. Yet, but quite clearly to not employ or to dismiss an employee who has not had the vaccine because of pregnancy or maternity would raise the spectre of indirect discrimination. So we will need to be careful there. Again, I think it's one about watching the recommendations rather than anything else, but one to keep an eye on. What about race? Race or nationality? Does that give us a particular issue? Well, what we know at the moment is that certain ethnic ethnic groups, and there was a survey that came out of the Leicester NHS Trust, which looked at the proportion of staff who had been vaccinated according to their particular ethnic group. And what we do see is there is a disparity between vaccination and ethnicity, with certain BAME groups not having taken up the vaccine quite so quickly as others. So it is possible, certainly, that someone who is of a particular ethnic group may be able to say, well, my particular ethnicity are disproportionately undervaccinated as a group, and therefore I am of a group put at a particular disadvantage by your requirement for me to be vaccinated within this job. The difficulty I think I would have with someone running that argument is that it's not enough that they belong to that group who are at a particular disadvantage, but they themselves must be put at that disadvantage. And I think it's quite easy to meet that to meet that assertion by someone by saying, well, is there anything that stops you being vaccinated? We know that you are of an ethnic group which is underrepresented in the vaccine population, but what stops you from having this vaccine? And the answer is likely to be, well, nothing, I can go ahead and have it. So I think that will be a very difficult argument to run as well. One of the things we will need to look out for, however, I think on race and nationality, is what happens with people who come to the UK from countries which are not able to offer the vaccine in quite such an extensive way. And I can see perhaps in future years that this may be an issue. There may be some countries where vaccines are not generally offered. Someone comes to the UK quite legitimately to take up employment, and they haven't been vaccinated, and the employer I think then has an issue with race or nationality. But actually, again, I think it's quite easily overcome if, as we expect to be the case, vaccines are still capable of being extensively offered in the UK, because it will be a case of saying to the person, well, go away, get vaccinated, come back. So I think it will be difficult to see many race cases here. Finally, other beliefs. You'll remember that when we're looking at the protected characteristic of religion or belief, it's not just religious beliefs, it's also other beliefs which are protected. There are requirements for those beliefs to be protected. They must be genuinely held. There must be a consistent philosophy around them. They must not be against public policy, etc. But what about someone who genuinely holds belief that vaccines are interfering with the natural order of things, and that these viruses are sent to ensure that population is properly managed? Could that be a belief worthy of protection? Possibly, but unlikely. Perhaps more possible is the idea that I will not be vaccinated because of the very rushed public clinical trials that have taken place here. Normally this would be a 10-year cycle, as we know, but it's happened very, very quickly. And I believe that it is wrong to introduce something into the wider population which has not been so thoroughly tested. Again, you can perhaps see it. What about the idea that this is all a plot to allow Bill Gates to microchip us all, or to introduce some other form of thought control? Genuinely held, are they beliefs worthy of protection? Almost certainly not. The tribunals have given very short shrift to conspiracy theorists in the past when looking at this area, and I think they would take the same approach. So when we're looking at indirect discrimination, and you actually start to drill down in how it will work, there are actually going to be very few cases, I think, where an individual can come forward and say, I have been indirectly discriminated against by your requirement that I be vaccinated before being able to work for you. Very few cases indeed. What about those cases where someone does establish that kind of entitlement. However, would we be able to say, well, yes, we know we're indirectly discriminating against you, but we have a good reason to do so. We have a legitimate aim, and the requirement for you to be vaccinated is a proportionate means of achieving that legitimate aim. What are the legitimate aims? Well, certainly health and safety for one, as Lou mentioned. Arguably in certain workplaces, a requirement to be vaccinated may protect you if, for whatever reason, that workplace has a higher propensity towards spread of COVID. So we can see health and safety being a legitimate aim. We can see protection of the public being a legitimate aim. If you are Pimlico plumbers and you are sending people into people's houses, then arguably we can see that it will be a legitimate aim to say we want to ensure that our customers are protected. I think we need more research around that, because, as I said, the signs are promising, but we don't necessarily know that being vaccinated prevents you from passing on the virus, rather than stopping, just giving you protection yourself. But certainly I can see that would apply. I think it could go even further and say, well, it gives us a competitive edge. If we are Pimlico plumbers and all of our people are vaccinated, that's a selling point to us when you compare us to, I don't know, Wandsworth plumbers who can't give that guarantee. So I think it's about protection of the public, but also a potential selling point. I think there's another one which is perhaps slightly more public spirited, which is it's about reducing the prevalence of the virus. And again, this depends upon the extent to which the virus is protected from being spread by the vaccine. But certainly, we are more likely to stamp out the virus and to stop mutation if more people are vaccinated. So I want to do, as an employer, I want to do my bit. I want to ensure we get rid of this awful disease, or at least keep it spread as low as possible. So I want my employees to be vaccinated, because then I am doing my bit. All of those, I think, could be legitimate aims. We then have to ask ourselves, though, is whether or not that the mechanism we are putting in place, the requirement to be vaccinated, is a proportionate mean in achieving that legitimate aim. And there, I think we have to look at various things. So, particular workplace risks. How likely is it that the workplace spreads the virus? So back to Lou's point, which is, we're lucky enough to be able to sit at home and work very remotely. Is it going to be proportionate if Lou and I are required to be vaccinated, given that we don't have to see anyone if we don't want to? Arguably not. It's disproportionately heavy. What about issues around the efficacy of the vaccine? We do know that it appears to be particularly effective, but if the efficacy is very low, then again, a requirement to be vaccinated might be disproportionate. And again, about this issue of whether it prevents spread to others, and indeed preventing illness itself. If the effect of preventing symptoms or transmission of the virus are actually pretty weak, then again, it's likely to be disproportionate to expect all employees to be vaccinated. Another issue, for how long does it last? If we all find out that actually within 3 months of having the jab, we're exposed to being infected and to being made ill by the virus, then again it would be disproportionate, I think, for an employer to insist on people being vaccinated. And the last point, I think, is one which we'll come on and deal with again in a minute, which is, well, how do we prove or disprove that someone's been vaccinated? If actually the paperwork around vaccination is pretty poor, pretty patchy, employers are just taking employees' words for the fact that they've been vaccinated and that it's up to date, then again there's a proportionality issue there. There's going to be a lot of holes in it. It's going to be difficult to enforce, and that will affect the extent to which it's regarded as legitimate. So I think what I'm saying with all of that is, first of all, there will be very few cases where it is indirectly discriminatory to refuse someone the employment because they have not been vaccinated. But I think if we do have someone in that position who can say, because of a protected characteristic, I am adversely affected by your requirement, then we're going to have to look very, very carefully indeed at justification. And we're not just going to be able to apply this blanket vaccine is good type message to be able to satisfy this particular test. I think we've got to wait to see more evidence of the vaccine and how it works, its efficacy, its ability to stop the spread of the virus. We've also got to consider the documentation that will surround the vaccine. And we've also got to be very, very clear as to the reason for which we are requiring these employees to be vaccinated. So from a discrimination perspective, my own view is there's an awful lot of hot air being talked about it. I do not think discrimination law is a significant risk for those employers who want to require employees to be vaccinated. And I think any employer who starts to meet objections based upon discrimination needs to sit down with those individuals or representatives who are saying that and say, okay, let's look at this. Let's run through the test. Let's look at why you believe there is unlawful discrimination here. Because actually, I think in most cases it will fall away. What about the other issue, dismissal? How's that going to work? Well, we know we're in territory of unfair dismissal for those employees who have over 2 years service. But let's say I'm an employer and I've decided that for whatever reason, I want my workforce to be vaccinated. I'm a hardliner on this. If they are not prepared to be vaccinated, then I do not care how long they have been with me. I want them out the door. What are my risks as an employer if I take that line? Well, the risk is an unfair dismissal claim. How are you going to defend that unfair dismissal claim if you are an employer? Well, as we know, for unfair dismissal purposes, the first thing you've got to do is to establish your potentially fair reason for dismissal. What would the potentially fair reason be in this case? Well, I'm sacking you because your conduct in refusing to be vaccinated is misconduct. Unlikely to succeed in my view. I do not think that a requirement to be vaccinated would, in most places, be a reasonable instruction. And therefore it would not be unreasonable for an employee to refuse that instruction. So I think there's a difficulty in going down that particular route. I think there is more likelihood of misconduct where someone has lied about the vaccine status. So if you've been able to bring in a policy which is everyone needs to be vaccinated and everyone has made that kind of declaration, and you find that actually people have been untruthful about their vaccine status, then I think that might be misconduct. Whether it's gross misconduct or not, I don't yet know. But I think that could be an argument. And we'll come back when we look at policy issues, how we may deal with that. I think a much better route for employers to go will be on this, some other substantial reason, potentially fair reason. This is a catch-all SOZA reason, which is to say, well, when balancing the interests of the employer against the employee, the employer's business interests win out. And I can see arguments around keeping the workplace safe, keeping customers safe, potentially stopping the spread of virus, potentially insurance requirements, etc., whatever they may be, as providing that some other substantial reason. Won't be in all cases. It shouldn't be a knee-jerk reason given, but I certainly think for those employers who feel very strongly about this and have a cogent case for putting it forward, then I can see that working. So some other substantial reason I think will be better than looking at this from a misconduct perspective. That, of course, is the first part of unfair dismissal or defending an unfair dismissal claim. What we've also got to ensure is that we've acted in all reasonably in all the circumstances of the case. we would have to look at a consultation. We would have to be very clear with our employees as to why we wanted this in place. Arguably, we would need to give a bit of time to reflect, to get vaccinated if they were needed to be, and also to consider any reasons why they were not prepared to be vaccinated before taking our final decision. We'd have to look at alternatives. Were there particular parts of the workplace where it was really important to be vaccinated, as opposed to people who were in the back office? And I've just had a question: we are a hospice. Would it be reasonable to bring in a policy re-vaccinations? I think that's the kind of example where yes, it would be, but you might not apply it all in the same way. It might be that you're looking at your frontline caring clinical staff in one way, but actually those staff who work in more administrative roles, who perhaps do not have to have anything to do with vulnerable patients, don't need to be vaccinated. There's a possibility there anyway, I think, of having a dual approach depending upon jobs. And it's also about balancing of interests. And again, back to the hospice example, you can see there is a really strong interest in ensuring that there is a minimum amount of any harmful virus in circulation. Might not be quite the same in a law firm where people work remotely. Might be very different. Might depend upon the reason you want people to have vaccines. If it is about health and safety, then that may be a much stronger issue than just being an employer who believes that vaccines are the right thing for society to do. We'll have to see. But certainly looking at employees' interests, taking it very seriously, is going to be important. Just another question: what about those admin-related roles that may come into contact with client-facing staff and therefore can be applied at all? Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. It's just an example, the extent to which you've got admin staff who are then dealing with the clinical staff or having to have contact with vulnerable groups, and you again may take the view that yes, they need to be vaccinated. But I think what you would do is you just consider the extent to which they were on that frontline basis. And I can see, and Lou, I suspect, will nod at this. This is where risk assessments are going to be key, and they're going to have to be quite granular in terms of the duties and the vulnerabilities protected if you are going to be looking at imposing a policy. So just a few practical issues and observations. As I've said, particularly in the context of age, currently not everyone can be vaccinated. It would be premature to impose a policy at this stage, just because we are not far enough into the vaccine cycle. And even Pimlico Plumbers actually did retreat a bit from their very assertive statement they initially put out. We need to wait and see precisely what the effect of the vaccine is. Clearly, the better immunity, the more certainty there is around the level of immunity that it gives, the more likely it is that you, as an employer, are going to be able to impose requirements. Which vaccine? This is an interesting question. We have become very familiar with the Pfizer, the AstraZeneca. We're going to become familiar with the Moderna. But there are many, many other vaccines around the world. And at the moment, we don't yet quite know how effective all of them are. We don't yet know which ones have a requirement for a booster annually, and lots of issues to be resolved. To what extent are employers going to have to keep on top of the particular type of vaccine that the employee has and the particular degree of efficacy, etc., that the vaccine gives? Okay, so I think we'll have to watch that and keep an eye on that. But again, it mitigates against the idea that we just impose a blanket policy one way or another. How do we ask employees to prove whether or not they've been vaccinated? Is it enough that they produce their NHS vaccination card? Probably not, because of the ability to forge those cards for them to go out of date, etc. There are a number of initiatives looking at this from a tech perspective. Israel are very far on a vaccine passport. The UK is funding various initiatives which will look at facial recognition software in terms of vaccination records, etc. So again, we need to wait and see what proof looks like. Very relevant there, of course, are privacy issues and data protection issues, because we're starting to deal with special category data, medical related data. So we can't get too assertive about asking individuals to be vaccinated. And finally, what about boosters? Again, this is going to go back to proof. It's going to go back to efficacy. It's going to go back to the type of vaccine. You know, we're going to have to find a way of being able to monitor and ensure that employees have kept their level of immunity up via vaccinations in certain cases. So, number of practical issues. Basic message there is, it's going to be too early now to impose that blanket policy, but start thinking about this type of issue. And when you're talking to your occupational health advisor, when you're looking at how you might start to introduce policies and procedures on these are the kind of questions we're going to have to be considering. So one other question just before I move on to the final slide I've got and pass back to Lou. What about freelancers who come into our premises? What can we ask them? It's an interesting question, and it's going to be again one of these points. To a certain extent, you've got more flexibility with freelancers as to what you require of them. And I think, again, there was a bit of a debate a while ago about freelancers warranting that they had no COVID symptoms before coming into premises. And I can certainly see that agreements will be developed which say that the freelancer is warranting that their vaccines are up to date. But it may need to go further. They may need to prove they've got their vaccine passport or whatever else. But certainly, I think we'll find the same rules apply to freelancers as to employees around that requirement. And yes, the slides will be shared after this. Final few points from me, just in terms of documentation. What should we be doing, or what should we just be thinking around here? We've seen talk of jab, no jab clauses going into contracts, i.e. it's a contractual obligation on you to be vaccinated. I don't like those clauses personally. I think they will come into employment contracts if vaccination becomes standard and certain, but they don't sit that well with me as clauses, given the fact that I think we will never be in a situation where there is a blanket requirement to have a vaccine, because there will be other issues around individual personal preferences, and because this is this does come back to human rights. So I wouldn't rush to put that kind of clause in the contract at all. I would be starting to think about our vaccine policy for staff, at the very least, just doing some soft promotion around the benefits of vaccine. That, you know, it's something we encourage staff to have. I think is important. That's certainly in accordance with the guidelines from NHS England. But just start to get your boards used to the idea that they're going to have to think about what this policy looks like. And I think also try to get them out of knee-jerk thinking one way or another, i.e., no, we're not going to worry about that. You know, people do what they want. Or alternatively, yep, everyone's got to be vaccinated, because it is not going to be that clear cut. So looking at some of the issues I put forward to with your board around the uncertainties and how the organisation thinks to be important. I'd also just start to think about what your internal guidance will look like as we get here. So what kind of exceptions would you be granting in terms of vaccines? Are there particular areas of business where you would not require it because the health and safety risk is low, or because there is no contact with particular groups? Or are there particular issues such as pregnancy where you would make exceptions? For pregnancy, for example, would you also look at medical suspension for someone who could not be vaccinated because of that? So looking at exemptions. We need to look at privacy issues very carefully. Keep an eye on what is happening with the vaccine passport debate. I think it's going to be very fast moving. There's already been a sea change in the UK government around vaccine passports. We will probably have some form of sort of techie vaccine passport within the next few months. And those passports are important, and adhering to them will be important because it will get us through what would otherwise be some very knotty data protection issues. So rather than thinking yourself, what kind of proof are we going to want to see, keep an eye out for what's happening on the passport, the vaccine passport debate, which of course goes to the last issue. Proof of vaccination is going to be via passports one way or another, undoubtedly. Those passports will also be useful, I think, for looking at any of the particular issues caused by different vaccines, and also looking at boosters and the extent to which boosters in vaccines will be needed. So that's where I think we're going to have to start to look at internal guidance and just keeping on top of things. Awful lot to do, awful lot to consider. There's a question about staff refusing to be tested. We'll come on to that, I think, in a minute. I'm just going to pass back to Lou for the final few slides.
Yeah, no. So basically, my advice from a health and safety perspective, and with regards to practical advice for employers at the moment, ties in completely with regards to what Matthew's already said. I wouldn't be jumping to draft a vaccine policy at the moment, but I think you do need to have, from an employer's perspective, just thinking in the background about the nature of your industry, how you work, the roles, and what the risks are to you. And off the back of that, as you're probably all aware, you should have a specific COVID-19 risk assessment in place. And it's worth thinking about that, thinking about updating that to reflect the vaccination program that's being rolled out, and to also reflect in particular where you've got people who are exempt from having the vaccination for whatever those reasons might be, for medical in particular. And just think about what practices and procedures you're perhaps going to have in place for those people that perhaps aren't recommended to have the vaccination. It's a very sensitive issue, as we've kind of already discovered, and with regards to the backdrop of the law that's in place at the moment, I think we're right to be saying, encourage your employees to follow the guidance, help them with to get to the benefits of the vaccination. But you have to approach this very sensitively, because it is still a personal choice. Our law says that it's a personal choice. So whilst you can encourage them, it's very much a matter for them in that respect. As always, with regards to the advice and the practices and procedures that you have in place within your workplace, it's important to have that dialogue with your employees, speak to them, be open and clear with them, and be sensitive to all the different personal issues that they may be facing. Engage with your employees with regards to what's happening, and keep up to date with the guidance in general. So basically, my advice from a health and safety perspective is keep a note on what's going on. I wouldn't be jumping to do a policy at the moment, but have in the background in your mind where you might be going with it, and look at your COVID-19 risk assessment to take into account the vaccination program that's now being rolled out. Do we want to deal with the other questions that's come through now before I just move on to my final slide, just a quick update?
Yeah, good idea, Lou. Thanks for that. So first of all, there's one on, I'll deal with one on, there's a couple on vaccinations, one observation, and also just one on testing. And then one, I think, on the stuff you're about to come on to, Lou, in terms of return to work. So someone comments, I got my patient record online with the GP and printed that out as it states all the necessary on it, and that I've had the jab. Yeah, I think that's a sort of the first stage in this for employers in terms of proof. I think there's a couple of issues with that. One, there is a data protection issue of expecting staff to produce NHS records. The other issue is just one of the veracity of that proof and the extent to which we're going to find such records are forged or not available for everyone or quickly go out of date. And that's where I think the tech will come in. And that's why I think we will find that passports, rather than relying upon individual NHS records, are going to be the key. So, like I say, I think we'll see that debate moving quite rapidly forward. If someone is in a customer role and they refuse to have a vaccine for a health-related reason, would it be appropriate to follow a capability policy procedure reassign them or dismiss. Yeah, I think at that stage you could look at capability. They're not capable of performing the job because of a capability reason. Therefore, you go down that capability route. I think the kind of consultation around that would be, first of all, looking at, well, what's the health reason that actually stops them being vaccinated, and I think we would expect them to have a degree of evidence around that. And I think the second issue would then be, well, okay, how important is it that the employee in that area is vaccinated? And clearly it's a customer facing role, so we would say it's very important. So I can see capability policies being used in that way in the future. Do potential staff members have to reveal their vaccine status to an employer? Good question. At the moment, no. I think where we will get to when there's a much more extensive vaccine coverage is that it will become a reasonable request to make of a staff member to advise us whether or not you have been vaccinated, because we require you to be vaccinated for this or other reason, or at least we want to know that you're not vaccinated, so that we can ensure you're not working with certain vulnerable individuals we might have, for example. So I think that will become a question which is quite commonly asked, and there will be an expectation that it's backed up with some kind of that kind of proof. But again, I think at the moment it's too early to ask it. Then we've got a question: what about staff who refuse to be tested? I think we're in the same position. And this is perhaps one which has been going on for some time, but is going to go on and is going to intensify with community testing becoming such a thing over the next few months. We need staff to ensure that they do not have COVID symptoms, and we need staff to ensure that they are not contagious in the workplace. And I think it will become, for a period of time, certainly while we're in this transition phase, I think it will become possible to say to staff that we require you to show us that you have a neutral antibody test before you commence work. And if you can't, then we can't let you work. I think that's quite likely to happen in the next few months. I think if you were trying to impose that at this stage, then it will be more difficult because, well, certainly without you having gone back over your risk assessment, which is something Lou could always talk to you about, and looking at the risk and comparing that to staff making individual declarations about whether or not they've got COVID symptoms. But again, I think along with asking staff about vaccine status, we're going to be in a situation where these questions are going to be asked and can be expected to be answered. One of the things which I think we could see from lockdown in the last few months is that our civil liberties, to a certain extent, have taken a back seat compared to issues of public health. And I think this is a further example where that may be the case. There's a question about timelines, but Lou, I'll let you come on to that. You're going to look at that anyway, I think, in terms of the roadmap, aren't you?
Yeah, so just a quick update with regards to the return to the workplace off the back of Boris's announcement on Monday with regards to the roadmap. At the moment, the message is still to stay at home and work from home where possible. And unfortunately, that message remains, and it's not actually dropped until the 21st of June, when they're hoping that restrictions are perhaps released, and that's stage 4 of the roadmap. Now, you might recall that back in March, we were sent home to work, and that was it. And then in August, it was released slightly for employers to make the decision with regards to where best their employees should be, provided that they made their workplace COVID secure. And then in September, we kind of took another step back a bit, where if you could work from home, if it was reasonably practicable to do so, then you were encouraged to work from home. But at that point, it was becoming apparent that for productivity reasons, for personal reasons, or for mental health reasons, that sometimes that wasn't reasonably practicable and it was impacting upon employees, that you were still able to go into the workplace. And then obviously we've had the January lockdown where the wording was changed to now, unless it's basically impossible to do your job from home, then you should be at home. Now we're still in the lockdown. We've not started the first stage of the roadmap, which is to commence next on the 8th of March. And most of you may well be aware that in the background to these announcements, you have the government guidance dependent upon all the different industries that then outlines what the requirements are. Now, at the moment, that guidance hasn't been updated. So I don't know what the wording will be in terms of working from home. The message from the roadmap is if you can work from home where possible, then you should continue to do so. But I don't know whether the wording will give us more leniency like it did in last August and in September, or whether it is going to be no, unless it's impossible, you should be at home working. So when that guidance is updated, which I suspect will be updated in March, when the first stage of the roadmap comes into play, then I'll do an update with regards to what the wording is, and therefore, as employers, what you should be thinking about in terms of where your employees should be, whether they should be coming back into the workplace or whether you should be encouraging them to work from home. But at the moment, as I said, the message is until the 21st of June, we're looking at working from home where possible. I suspect that wording might change, but I'll update you as soon as I know what that position is, and whether we do another webinar or an article, there'll be some more guidance coming out after that point.
Lou, there's a question which is relevant to that. So what if shielding staff want to return to work because they cannot work from home?
Again, the wording is if it's impossible. If you can, I think if they're shielding, if there's an alternative to allow them to work from home, then you should be having that dialogue with those employees, speak to them. Again, it's all about engagement with your employees, because someone who's shielding is at a heightened risk, or they're deemed to be a heightened risk. And therefore, as an employer, if you can make alternative arrangements to enable them to work from home, then that's what you should be doing. But again, it's very much dependent upon that employee. What does that employee want to do? You need to take that into account. If they're saying, I want to come back into the office, and your office or your workplace is COVID secure, and you've thought about all the steps that you can put in place, then again, you just need to be having those discussions about what's appropriate. And it is very much employee dependent and personal circumstance dependent. Yeah. Again, it's all about dialogue. It's all about
no blanket ban, but something to be very, very cautious about.
Absolutely. I mean, if, as I said, the wording is impossible. If they cannot do their job, if there's no other alternative, and if they're happy to go into the workplace, provided they're COVID secure, they can still go to work. But I would just be mindful in the background of doing all that you can to keep them at home if possible.
And of course, at the moment, furlough is still an option for those staff as well. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for that. We've had some questions. I'm conscious of the time. It's just tipped over the hour. Lou and I are obviously happy to stay on and answer as many questions as you have, but some of you may be keen to go and do other things. But do feel free to contact us at any point with any questions you have, and we'll do our best to answer them. Thanks everyone for listening and watching today. I hope you found that useful. I think the message is there is an awful lot of uncertainty still. Be careful of what the press are saying around all of this. There's an awful lot of press being written just to fill column inches, I think, and it's really a case of going back to basics, going back to look at and thinking, right, what does the law say on this? What's the health and safety position? What's the equality position? What's the unfair dismissal position? What do we as an employer want to do? You know, how do we really feel about this? Just before we go, there is a feedback form which will pop up, I think, as you click out. We're always really grateful for any feedback we get. It just helps us plan, prepare, and decide what subjects, etc. we're talking about. So if you can fill out those, then that would be great. But thanks very much for your time today.